Alright, so let's dive into the Surface Mimic Skin Scans provided by Paul Callender. Let's open up one of them now. And here we go. So if you guys aren't familiar with this technique was originally created by Gino Acevedo over at Weta Digital for Avatar. So what they ended up doing was taking people as volunteers to cast plaster casts of their face, of their hands, of their arms, their feet, and then lining that plaster cast with a very thin layer of silicone. When that silicone dries, they peel it off, cut it up, pin it down to a board, and then scan it. Actually, Weta did it a little bit differently. They actually sunk it into a vat of baby oil when they scanned it, so it would eliminate any kind of extra specularity. Not sure if Paul Callender did the same technique, but either way, this is what we end up getting. And what's so powerful about these scans is that they're void of any color information that could interrupt the surface detail, the pores and the wrinkles. So for example, if we were to load human face, take a look at this. So traditionally, as a texture painter, I would get images something like this. I would have to paint out all the specularity, take out all the shadows and the highlights, make it as even as possible, project it as color maps, and then inevitably convert them to grayscale and turn them into fine displacement maps. The problem with that technique nowadays is that there's a lot of color information that, when converted to grayscale, does not translate properly into proper one-to-one surface pore details. So if we were to zoom into the forehead, you'll see a lot of blemishes on the face that are purely color information. So this does not translate properly if we were to turn this into a grayscale map. Same with all these specular highlights and these hits on the face from all the oil on his skin. When converted, that's not going to really react right. I mean, for all intent and purposes, in the past it has worked for 90% of the time, which is why it was the chosen methodology. But you know, areas like the stubble is kind of a problem area, because if you were to convert that, all these dark areas would actually indent in, which is the opposite of what you want. So you have to do a lot of trickery and Photoshop manipulation to get that to work right. Where nowadays we have maps like these that are pure surface detail. So it's a very, very powerful set of maps that I'll be providing you guys to use. However, as it stands, for me, after a bunch of trial and error, I've deemed this map as it is not quite adequate for the needs that I need for painting the tertiary detail. And the main problem is that there's too much low frequency information in here for my liking. So these really dark areas, some of these light areas, and some of these low frequency areas, it's going to be a problem for me when I try to take these maps and use them in clever ways in my color maps and specular maps. So I've devised a little workflow in order to eliminate some of this really low frequency stuff and maintain the higher frequency and mid frequency work. What I ended up doing is taking the base layer, duplicating it, and doing a high pass to it at 35 pixels. Typically I would recommend against using the high pass in a lot of circumstances, because people typically set it at like 10, and what happens is you flatten everything out and it's just too even and too flat that it just ends up looking very CG. And I think a lot of people rely on the high pass a bit too much in order to get displacements, and you have to be very clever with it. So you can't just do a high pass and call it a day. It just won't work that way, and your overall maps won't look right. So what I end up doing is a two-step process. I set this at 35 pixels. So what's happening is I'm getting rid of that really low frequency stuff, the stuff that I don't want. but maintaining everything else. So if I were to zoom in, I'm maintaining these high points on these pores and some of these dark points, but I'm getting rid of that really low frequency stuff. Now, some people may argue that this low frequency information I should leave in, and I don't necessarily dispute that. However, if we were to go back to Mari and take a look at these ZBrush maps, a lot of that really low frequency stuff is already in there, and I don't want to compete with it. So as it stands here, these are going to be very difficult to work around because you're going to be competing with some of this low frequency stuff. So what I want to do is take that out, and so it really saves me a lot of time and headache when I start painting. However, I'm not done here, because if I zoom in, this still is a bit soft for me, and what I've found over the years is it's very important to have a little bit more crisp detail in the fine displacement, because inevitably when we put a skin shader on it, because of the nature of subsurface scattering, it's going to soften a lot of this stuff out. And the first thing to go is the fine detail. So we want to accentuate that fine detail just slightly more than it actually should be, because when the subsurface comes into play, we're going to get more crisp detail. So when it renders, we're going to get this nice crisp stuff, because as it stands, it's going to go a bit soft. So in order to get that, I'm going to take the original base layer, duplicate it, bring it up top, do another high pass, however this time at 15 pixels, and then do an overlay. So if I were to zoom in, what we're doing is we're pulling out just a little bit more information from the highs and lows. And we're getting that crisp, nice detail. So we go from that to that. So from that to that. And that's exactly what I want. And I'm really happy with this. So this is the basis for the maps that I'll be using to project in Mari. So I'm going to go here, I'm going to create a new folder called Sharpened, and drop this in as a TIFF. And there we go. So let's go and do this process again. Go in here, duplicate the layer. This is the 15%. Duplicate the base layer again. Sorry, 15 pixel. Set this to 35 pixels, and then do an overlay. And there we go. We're taking all that low frequency stuff out. Because this vein here, even though that's technically in the subject that was casted, if we were to go back to ZBrush, you can see that Ben's already done that. So again, we don't want to compete, so we're taking that out. So this is where it's good to, if you are working with a modeler, to talk to your modeler and explain to him what you're putting in there, so he has a very clear idea of what you're doing. And every once in a while, the maps that you paint for this tertiary detail, it's actually advantageous to give back to him so he can bump up some of his secondary detail based off of this tertiary. A prime example is stuff in the hands. So a lot of the fine wrinkles in the hands, which unfortunately we won't be going over, but a lot of the fine wrinkles in the knuckles are really dictated nicely by the skin scans provided by Paul. So in the past, what I've ended up doing was painting the fine displacement, giving it to my modeler, and then he sees where those wrinkles are and then puffs up the details just to get the kind of the skin folding and the crunching that you get with the knuckle areas. And it produces just a beautiful result because he's got his primary and secondary forms, I've got my tertiary, and then I'll give him the tertiary, and then he'll just accent the tertiary details. And you just get a really elegant look in the end. So let's just one more time go through this again so you guys get this down pat. I'm going to duplicate this. That's the 35 pixel high pass. I'm going to duplicate again, bring it up top, and do a 15 pixel high pass and overlay. And as you can see, it's just really bringing out all that beautiful scan detail. And another thing about these scans is you can really see how much variation there is in the pores from 6 inches. It just is incredible. And you can see all the Langer lines on the face and how the stretching happens. And this stuff just is extremely difficult to get from a photograph. It's almost impossible to get this kind of detail. And this is the stuff that really sells photoreal skin. So I'm really excited that Paul's been gracious enough to provide us these scans, because you get this really nice neck pore work. It's kind of chicken skin, goosebumpy, to the pores in the face, the cheeks, right below the eyes. It's just wonderful stuff that we just get for free. We're not going to worry about this dark line here. When we start painting the lips, we'll get into how to minimize that. But for the most part, this is exactly what we want, as opposed to that, where this is just not workable for us. But that is. So I'm going to save that. And I'm just going to go through all those PSDs and do the same thing. So I encourage you guys to grab the PSDs. I haven't graded any of those, and do this process to them so you guys get an idea firsthand of how to create cleaner scans, because a lot of Paul's skin scans will come out looking like this. So if you were in the future to buy some of his extra ones, he's got a bunch of females, a couple other males, and he'll be adding more in the future. You'll know what to do to achieve much better base reference. So when we start going into Mari, it's nice and clean and really easy to use. So in the next section, we're going to load these into Mari and get projecting.